This is Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. When I think about the critical issues facing Black and brown residents in the St. Louis area, I often ask the questions: how did we get here? What's holding us back? And how do we progress? At 9 PBS, we want to deepen our understanding and change the narrative. Join me as I look for answers and discover solutions on today's podcast. The end of the Civil War saw a dramatic increase in the number of Black newspapers, and by 1890, there were 575 of them operating in the United States. On March 17, 1928, the St. Louis American newspaper was published for the very first time to give the Black community a voice. What is the role of the Black press today? We talked to the longtime publisher, Dr. Donald M. Suggs.
Listen, St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center and the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation.
I have to say up front that my next guest made a dream come true in my life, a professional dream come true, and he knows his story, and I don't think he likes it when I tell it because it's me fawning over him a little bit. I had a dream always to be a columnist, and our next guest came to me one time and he said, "You should write a column in the St. Louis American." And I'm looking around like, who are you talking to? And he was talking to me, and I did write a column in the St. Louis American newspaper for 10 years. So let me say again publicly, Dr. Donald M. Suggs, publisher of the St. Louis American, thank you for making that professional dream come true.
Well, it was certainly in our interest and the audience's interest and the community's interest. So I'm glad it worked out for both of us.
Definitely. And thank you for coming on the podcast. We've got...
Oh, I'm excited and honored.
I have my dictionary ready because you are quite I call him an intellectual, so he's going to say something that I'm going to have to look up.
I don't know about that.
Let me say as well that we want you to subscribe. We want you to share this podcast and the video on YouTube. You don't want to keep all this good conversation to yourself, so do share it. And also leave us a comment. Dr. Suggs will say something that will move you or something that will raise an additional question. Feel free to leave a comment and I will get back to you for sure. Thank you so much for subscribing and sharing the podcast. You bought the paper in the early 80s. Take me back then. Why did you want to be, as you were an oral surgeon at the time, why did you want to be a publisher of a newspaper?
Well, I was more interested in, I was raised with the expectation that we should all try to be of service. And I had the impression, I've always been very much interested in and attracted to journalism. I grew up in a very materially poor family, but we always had a newspaper. And so I was always very strongly, attracted to the idea that newspapers, journalism, are so essential to our communities are organized, and so the opportunity to be a part of, at that time, two other partners came to me, and I was just enthusiastic about joining them. And subsequently, I was able in 1984 to have complete control, or at least be the publisher, the sole publisher, and it's been a wonderful experience for me personally, and hopefully it's been of some value to the community.
Am I right that in the early 80s, the circulation was 4,000?
Well, I think we acquired the paper. The group, actually there was an initial group, and then one of the members unfortunately passed away, and then I was brought in, and then subsequently there was also the issue of who was going to control, and it ended up in 1984. However, when the paper was acquired, I think it was a for pay paper, and they probably had 4,000 to 6,000 circulation. Of course, it was a very different community, more compact, and I think that was probably more substantive than that number would indicate in those times, in those days, because it was pass around and
right.
But no, instantly we sort of, when I had control, we had to have a larger reach larger audience.
And what is that audience today? What's the circulation today?
Well, not what it was in print. The circulation in print got as high as 70,000. But as you know, with this transition, audience interests, the market's interests are very much changed. The environment. I think we're now 42 to 45,000 a week. There still is an interest in the newspaper, but it's available for our readers at no cost.
I will tell you, that I often read the digital version.
Yes, I think that so do I. As a matter of fact. Yes, I think the industry's changed a lot over the last 40 years, and we've been trying to respond to that change. It really enables us to reach a much larger audience, and we're not still in the middle of a transition, into more activity on our digital platforms. We're still learning, but we're absolutely convinced that we have to be more available where people are, and then rather than being a once a week newspaper, now we're able to make stories available and on a 7-day a week basis.
Right.
Yes.
And everybody's changing in the media landscape in this regard, that I also find many of the stories via a short video on Instagram.
On Instagram,
yes.
If you're not active on these platforms, you're just going to be not viable. You have two customers in this. I call it customer. I hope that's not being inaccurate.
Consumer still, yeah.
Consumer, how we want to characterize it. But as a free newspaper, clearly somebody has to provide the revenues, and you have to be able to offer a value proposition to the people that are going to invest on the commercial side, and that means they want an audience, and because they want return on their investment. So you're going to have to be where the audience is. And, of course, when you've been around 40 years, people who were 40 years in 1984, many of them not even around anymore, and certainly not the customer they're looking for.
Right.
So, I mean, anytime you're going to be static when everything around you is changing. So that's one of the challenges we have, is to try to be certain that we can adapt to the changes. And but there are challenges in bringing about that kind of substantial change.
And what is the most challenging thing right now for the St. Louis American newspaper as it continues to target and be a voice for the Black community?
Yes. Among the things that are challenging is that the way young people consume information, access information, is just so different now than what it was before. When I was a young person, young people did not read newspapers, but as they got older, they did read newspapers. Now the young people don't read newspapers, and they never will read newspapers. So the challenge is to, and remember, there's so much information available, so much access, that you have to be able to, win the attention. I do think there's an opportunity for community newspapers. There's a kind of intimacy, a kind of ability to tell stories that would not otherwise make it to the general market media. So I do think there's a need. I think there's a market for it as well. But I think you have to. The writing has to be good, the photography has to be good, the graphics have to be strong, and the challenge is, how do you get the resources for that? The other challenge, of course, is that when we acquired the St. Louis American, we were able to attract some very talented writers who spent some time at the American. And now, if you get someone very talented and able, then you're likely to be taken away. That's just the nature of how things are. It's also very pricey. People are very expensive, and people have to have a living wage. We're working on a model that enables people to come and spend some time, for instance, with the American, with the expectation perhaps this is not going to be their destination, but they want to spend some time in their community with a broad access to what's going on to in their communities and not restricted perhaps to just a single beat. So there are I think there's some trade-offs available. But yes, that's a major challenge, I would say, to have the people who are able and willing to spend some time with a black newspaper.
Readership is one thing for sure. You need that. But then, as you mentioned, it is expensive. People are expensive. Ink is expensive. Paper is expensive. So how is it still a challenge to convince advertisers that the consumer who is consuming this product digitally and in print is a viable person that you should be spending your ad dollars on?
Well, I think probably the most maybe compelling reason is that now you're speaking directly to a consumer. In most cases, because the people that are reading the St. Louis American are going to be African Americans. However, there's also 20% of our readership, of our audience, is not black in our latest study. But it is that you're making a direct appeal to them. You're saying, we want your business. And there is a segment of the black community that's very interested in going where they're likely to be welcome, where they're likely to be appreciated. And having said that, Carol, much of our income, I mean, a substantial part of our income does not come simply from traditional newspaper or even online advertising. It comes from other kinds of programs, grants. So we're kind of a potpourri of resources. There'd be no way for us to survive if we were depending solely on our traditional newspaper.
And is the Newspapers in Education program, which is highly successful for
yes,
you.
and one of the things I'm most proud of. I just
Describe what that is.
Newspaper in Education primarily is based around what we call a STEM page, where we have information that is culturally specific, in the sense that we will have, for instance, a photograph of a classroom. We'll also have an outstanding person in the field. If we're talking about geology, there'll be a geologist who's very distinguished. But there'll be some information that is created by professional educators, childhood educators. And that very good information, and it goes into thousands of classrooms, but it's available online, which means families can have access to it. And it's targeted with the notion that we should let our children know this is something you can do. They know they can play football.
Right.
They know they can play baseball. They know they can sing.
They think they can rap.
Yeah, I think their idea about music. But those things are something that we are accustomed to and something that we many people aspire to. However, they don't think about the fact that they could be scientists. And what we're telling them, what we're telling classroom educators, what we're telling school leaders, what we're telling parents, that these kids ought to, at a very early age, be encouraged to look at science as something that they can do.
Right.
There are people just like you that do this. They do it at a very high level. They're very accomplished. And I do think if they see it, it's just different. I mean, I think I'll use a sports metaphor. Back in the day, if you had a certain size, you played cornerback in football. And now you can be a quarterback. Well, back in the day, you didn't even think about being an NFL quarterback. So now you have a number of black quarterbacks in the league because they're raised from early years that they can be a quarterback if they have a certain kind of skill set. My father went to the third grade, and pardon me if I digress for a moment.
That's okay.
My father is just such an extraordinary person. They went to the third grade. In the days of rigid segregation, for family reasons, he left school. He's very bright, and even into his adult years, very interested in astrophysics. And I had a friend who was a PhD in physics, and they would talk, quantum physics. And so the point I'm making in citing my father is that nobody recognized this bright young fellow could do physics. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of black people that could do this work. but it's never encouraged. It's not encouraged because nobody thinks that's what we do. And we've been taught, we've been programmed to feel that this is not something we ought to. There are people who have a certain affinity to do math, to do these sorts of things. They have that kind of ability to reason. And so we've got to make it clear to them early in their careers, over in their educational experiences, that this is something we do. We do this.
We're able.
We do this. We do this. We play quarterback, but we also do physics. And we do, when I went to dental school many years ago at Indiana University, there were 120 medical students. There were 5 black medical students. There were 5 Jewish students. There were 5 women. Washington University School of Medicine is one of the elite medical schools in the country, which means in the world. Half of the freshman class are women. That's in 50 years. So I think that, but women were told before, if you wanted to do medicine, unless you were really quirky, you became a nurse, which is honorable. But physician, that was for men. That was a male profession.
White male.
White male in particular. And now we see the number of black women that are practicing medicine. And I think it's been good for medicine. It's been good for
it's good for the
patients.
patient.
Absolutely. I just had eye surgery, 2 women surgeons. But for years and years and years, people just had the notion that this is not what we do. And I think you see that in a class society, in a society, if you don't mind the expression, a racialized society where people are told this is what we do, this is what we. So my father was a living example for me of someone, I mean, I was just so amazed. And he was known in the neighborhood as being this odd fellow who read books with no pictures. That's how Morris Suggs was seen. And what he was a man who had an extraordinary mind. And
when did you realize that, though? When did you
well,
realize that?
I think when you grow up with your parents, I think the older you get, the smarter they.
True.
So I was fortunate to grow up in a family of 2 very remarkable people, loving people who were very nurturing people. So I had the benefit. I grew up in a tough, it's just a young black male, grew up in a tough neighborhood. And I had these sort of inclinations that made me live kind of a double life, because I sort of like these things. I grew up in a place called East Chicago, which is a smoky industrial town, mostly immigrants. Blacks from the South, Eastern Europeans, and Hispanics from Mexico y Puerto Rico. But I spent my summers as a teenager with my grandparents on the south side of Chicago when it was really, the south side was really quite, it was a very lovely place, and I had access to museums, so I could sort of indulge these things that I wouldn't let my peers know about, because you'd be sort of the odd kind of person.
Right.
And the same thing with language. I mean, my basic language is Ebonics, but you learn how to code switch a little bit, and you're not aware of what your sensibility really is, the kind of music you like. Obviously, I like, blues. I love the jazz. I love gospel music a lot. But also, our classes were able to go to classical concerts, and it was almost like forbidden, but yet it was very compelling. The music was, maybe not Mozart, but certainly Beethoven. I mean, just dum-dum-dum-dum. You could feel that way beyond just entertainment. I mean, rhythm and blues was fine. Jazz was great, more complicated, more interesting. But classical music, oh my goodness.
And if you guys are listening, I know you're listening right now, do not go anywhere, because what you hear Dr. Suggs talking about will lead us into a conversation about him as an art collector, and we will get to that before I let him leave this studio. But I was so intrigued to read about the Chicago Defender back in the day, because someone said to me when they knew I was going to be talking to you, ask him to talk about the Black press and the Great Migration, its impact on the Great Migration. The Great Migration being the largest movement of people from one part of the country to the next,
yes.
and that's from the South, from the violence of the South to the North. And the Chicago Defender's credited with its reports getting thousands of Black people to encouraging them to come to Chicago.
Yes.
Then we know civil rights movement. Black reporters are going down south and reporting on the brutality, reporting on the lynchings.
Yes.
I can't imagine as a reporter today, I can go anywhere today and not worry about it. That was not the case for reporters, Black reporters from the civil rights movement. You talked about your parents, but how were you informing yourself in the 60s?
Well, of course, going to school, predominantly white school, we didn't learn any Black history, and I learned a lot of what I knew about Black history and stuff, quite frankly, in my college years, and subsequently, after I'd finished school, I always had sort of an inkling. Remember, I grew up in an industrial town, a blue-collar town, and we had political activists that would come to town, primarily left-wing, maybe communists, perhaps, but explaining how things came to be as they were. So that was my first introduction to the Black experience in America. It was a left-wing, these were white organizers primarily, and so you got an inkling of that from them. Sort of trying to explain what your circumstances were. It wasn't that you were, and why. Right. You were not a subordinate people. You were not. It's just you had been mistreated and you'd been brought to this country under these kinds of circumstances. So that was the beginning. And the second thing for me was when I started to meet, because my aspirations were more like most working class young people, is to have nice things, to be a member of the upper middle class. But I met artists, what I call creators, makers of things. They wrote poetry, they wrote plays, they composed music, they made paintings, and it was for them a calling. They weren't casual. It wasn't something that they were doing because it was popular or even likely to make them well known or earn a lot of money. Mm-hmm. No, they were. And so that's when my real education started, quite frankly. And then I learned a great deal. You start then reading some of the most important works around this, and you start reading Black writers. And I think that for me was, and then the more you know, the more curious you are, and more. And the one thing about one's life experience in the United States is a lot of this information is available. It's not foisted on you. It's not encouraged, at least in my generation, but it's available. It's in the books. And I think that a lot of it is we just don't seem to take advantage of what some of the real opportunities are to educate ourselves. I mean, some things that public education is going to inform you about. But the other thing is you're going to have to take your own responsibility in your family and in your community institutions. So it's something that's and I think the Black press at one time when the Black community was much more, one would say in most terms, more monolithic. But now when you see, as you pointed out as a journalist, you're not confined to the Black press in the way that we were back in the days of the Chicago Defender. Some very distinguished writers, Langston Hughes, Walter White, a number of very distinguished writers who wrote for the Black press because white press, newsrooms weren't available to them. As a matter of fact, there's probably no profession where you have more people who are operating at the highest level of the profession than you do journalism. I mean, some of the major newspapers in the United States now have been or are run by African Americans. That wasn't the case many, many years ago. So they were a major force. The thing about the civil rights movement, it opened the door for a number of people, even as with the shifts in the economy and all that, a number of people were locked more, what I'd describe as maybe the forgotten or the, how do they characterize them? They're the forgotten or the, in any kind of way, they've been really subordinated. They're restricted to the worst schools, the worst neighborhoods, and you see the results of that in our, our nightly newscasts and stuff. While there's another group of African Americans that have never had it so good.
Right.
They've been able to. So now, one lives in St. Louis, it's Chesterfield or whatever, or you move to Houston or Atlanta or Charlotte, then you move to the nicer neighborhoods based on your income. So there have been some changes for a number of African Americans, but there's huge, large numbers of African Americans still suffer, under the difficulties of, being black in America.
Well, one can wonder how we got here, but I think historically we have an understanding, and we can look at the crack cocaine epidemic and how government responded, and this 3 strikes you're out, and how politicians responded to the need to quell.
Sure. Yeah, and I think a lot of it's by design, and I think that what we're seeing now in the extreme form is the kind of separation of the races. I think we were moving in a very interesting direction. I'd say after the 60s, I mean, that was quite something. The Voting Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Bill, we're moving in that direction, more integration. A hospital like Homer Phillips that was born in the age of restrict segregation, it did close for a number of reasons, but also there were more opportunities for African Americans. I mean, now you see African Americans prominent medical schools, and these things were not available to them. So there's been some progress. However, what you see now, when there are a lot of challenges for the United States, and everybody's scapegoating, and as the demographics shift, as we don't see a white population being the majority, years going forward, you see a kind of a hardened response. As pleased as we were to see President Obama come to power, you still have some vestiges of resentment about that situation. So in some ways, for some African Americans, best of times, but I would argue that that's tenuous. What we see today, what the choices are now, what's happened to the Republican Party, I don't know how much we ought to get into politics on this podcast, but it's just the fact. So much of this is racially based. It's based around ideology, a lot of it, racial undergirdings and stuff. So there's a lot of challenges, and I think that this kind of separation of blacks, based on one's socioeconomic circumstances and all, there's an exception to that. I think black women have kind of sort of stayed the course. The last election, we saw 20% of black males voting for Donald Trump. So that shows you just how things can shift.
Right.
And I think that it's not overstating the case to say these are perilous times, and one doesn't know what the outcomes are going to be to some of these things that are going on today. I think what happens in 2024 is going to be extraordinarily important in the direction of this country, whether we move toward more authoritarianism, and I don't think that's being an alarmist. I think this is being realistic.
Based on what we see. You mentioned tenuous. A dear friend of mine said that a difference between now and then, whenever then was, is we are nowhere near a unified people. We were monolithic. We've never, in a way, haven't been monolithic for a long time. And now we are even less so. And then put on top of that social media and the desire to perhaps be seen and look like you have wealth, although you don't have it, that we are not unified and therefore are weakened when there's a need to move as one or speak as one.
I certainly understand, where our fundamental interests lie. It's so easy when you have wealth and celebrity to recognize, again, how tenuous all that is. And then, unfortunately, we see some of the most successful African Americans not aligning themselves with, their people, even though their circumstances have improved. You have large number of our people who are not, and to say that we're going to abandon them because they are, for whatever reason, not doing as well as I am, I think that's unfortunate. I think that I don't believe in anti-white people, although I do believe that there's some institutions that don't serve us well, and I think for us to ignore that. But having said that, Carol, so many African Americans that are successful not because they have black customers or they have black patients or they have black constituents. It's because they've been successful, if you will, in the white world, and they have abandoned their interest in their people. And I think that's very short-sighted and unfortunate. Now, people of my generation who were born in, as I said earlier, an age of rigid segregation, you don't forget, and so they want you to explain why we see all of this antisocial behavior among African Americans, particularly young males, and they're not, well, certainly we don't approve of that behavior. But I always go back to the original statement is how this come to be. When you isolate people in that way, when you treat people in that way, when they're forced in these kind of living circumstances. So what about yourself? Well, what about me? Yeah, sure. I mean, I had parents, exceptional parents, who were very loving parents. They had very little, but they gave it all to their children. Everything they had, they gave to their 3 children. And so for every person like a Donald Suggs, who's like average, there are 100 kids who weren't, fortunate to have the kind of parents I had. And, so I don't take any particular satisfaction. And I've been able to, provide reasonably well for my family and all that. But there were dozens of young people that I grew up with were just, who's talented,
right.
Who's smart, who's charismatic, who's quick with numbers, who can learn this, so they just didn't have the benefit of the same, kind of household that I had.
I often say, there by the grace of God go I.
That's perfectly
That is
said.
it.
But for the grace, exactly.
And I laugh when you say that you're average, because the man is a retired oral surgeon.
Well, let's not talk about that.
You can't stop me.
Okay, I can't
you
stop
know,
you, but I can disagree with you. I think,
Well-
seriously, Carol, I think that you gave me a spiritual explanation, but there's a secular explanation too. It comes from a white singer, and he says, life is a lottery, and many people lose. So I was fortunate. When everybody got ready to go steal, I sort of made up an excuse why I couldn't go. I had to go get my mother's medicine.
And why
something.
did you make up that excuse?
Well, I think it's because
You were thinking of your parents.
As a young person, I'm serious. I used to worry why she wore clothes like. Why didn't she wear nicer clothes? Or why didn't she have her hair in those days done? You know why? She didn't have the resources.
And by the same token, my father was a drill sergeant, as you know.
Yes.
My mother was a stay-at-home mom.
Yes.
My father, 8th grade education. And I worried into my adulthood that I had not embarrassed my parents and I not embarrass my father. Growing up in the military, your behavior could impact his career access, and he could lose stripes, he could lose position based on how his children behave. So I grew up understanding that, and I often say, am I average? No, but I don't want to be rare. I don't want to be
Well,
rare
but you
as
have a
a.
special talent. I mean,
Well,
most
you
of
do
us.
too.
No, well, I don't think so, but I do think this. I think that the kind of values instilled in us in early days, even when we fall short of those values, those are values instilled in me.
Because then conviction comes in for me.
Certainly.
Conviction when I
Yes,
fall
yes,
short.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my parents, not only did they speak it the way the household was, it was sacred, the way everybody was protected, the way, there was no avoiding personal responsibility. I mean, we had to work, but my father worked hard, and my mother, was. So I was, one of those fortunate kids. But despite all that, there were some times easily I could have gone off the tracks, easily, because in trying to align with your peer group. Remember now, I'm several generations older than you. And these communities were replete with the kind of temptations, if you will. My cousin, who I'm very close to, when he was 16, his girlfriend got pregnant. In my family, that meant you marry her.
Right.
So any future you think you might have
Is with this baby
is
now.
foreclosed. Look, boy, you marry that girl. Okay, you know what I'm talking about, Carol. So I think that there was difference perhaps now in the community, but that's the community I grew up in, and so in a lot of ways, that community was very supportive of me as a young boy growing up, and tried to provide a little scholarship help for you when you went to go to college and stuff. But I think we have to be careful about citing an experience that turns out reasonably well when there are thousands of more worthy
Right.
people. I try to make that case always. They say, well, Donald, you're so, compared to what? What you say?
Well, and I for me, one of the reasons that I focus so much on who you are and who you were and who I am and who I was is to then say, because I don't leave it there, I'm successful. Yay for me. My parents did a great job. Yay for them.
Yes.
Is to say that you can be here too. And I'm supposed to because
I love it.
because yay for my parents,
Yes,
because
yes.
yay for me.
Yes.
I am supposed to then
Yeah,
give
yes.
whatever wisdom, resource, knowledge.
Yes.
you know.
And it's not giving back for me. It's an obligation.
Right,
It's a
right.
sacred obligation.
Yes,
this is
I
what
agree.
we are here to do. And so, if you're going to, adhere to your teachings, the preaching, we follow the teachings of Christ. If you listen to what he's telling you, who we should embrace,
Right.
who we should care for.
It is the stranger on the road.
Precisely. Now that resonated with me as a young boy. I'm going to tell you a touching moment. My mother was in the hospital, and while she was there, she met this young Mexican girl, and she had what they call fits. She had epilepsy, and she said, "Miss Suggs, your son Donald, when they teased me, he wouldn't let them tease me." I mean, it brought me to tears because what I was expressing was what my parents taught me. That little girl who's helpless and she has something she can't help, and you tried to help her. Now I was like any other little boy. I never thought about it that way. But that wasn't me. That was my parents. Those are the values of my parents. So when I hear my granddaughter, who's had a much more privileged, in a material way, a much more privileged life than myself, saying, "Papa, this is unfair." They used the N-word at her little private school, and she got up in front of the whole assembly and said, "They told me not to be a snitch. I'm not being a snitch. I'm just not tolerating that. It is wrong." And so if I'm unpopular, I'll take it. So as a grandparent, I see my parents teaching, expressing themselves in my granddaughter, who is a privileged, in material terms, little girl. So those are kind of things, those are kind of life experiences that to me are so rewarding, because it's a sense that, you are following, you're doing what you're supposed to do, what you were taught to be. what people express is their value system
Right.
comes from their faith, and that's an expression of it, in my view.
And so we continue to have to look at ourselves and what my friend said, us not being a unified front now, making it more difficult for us to move as one to address those amongst our people who are not behaving, who were not given what we were given. We have to intervene, and I know that that's what the paper represents for you.
Well, we try to, obviously with a paper, you have a limited amount of resources and you can't do what, is, I do admire fine writing. I do admire journalism, as I said earlier in our commentation about the special respect I have for journalists because I think the role they play is so important in the society writ large. But I also think who represent a point of view, that is not often stated. So I'm a great. So I believe that many years ago we started a newspaper when I was in junior high school with a young white boy, and so I've always had a real love for. Unfortunately, I did not have writing skill. I have a son who passed away, who was brilliant, and he was a writer. He was a very fine writer, and so I was very proud of him. He had the option to pursue whatever profession he wanted, but he wanted to be a writer. He was a fine one, and that made me so proud.
Does the paper have influence today, and do you want to influence political policy, period?
Well, politics operates on a lot of levels,
For
ward
sure.
politics, and there's undergirding with philosophy, and so it depends on what level of politics you're talking about. I think in a close race, perhaps what we emphasize or even what we maybe endorse may have some value on the margins. I mean, the measure of that is how politicians treat the American. I would say to you, most major candidates, particularly on the Democratic Party side, do come to visit, and some of them we interview. And so I think the answer to your question more directly is I think maybe on the margins some.
I've never told you this story before. And as I mentioned, I wrote a column for the paper for a decade, and I did get criticism. There was a time I wrote a story for my former employer radio station when the paper endorsed Mayor Jones
Yes.
over Lyda Crewson.
Crewson, yes.
And one of her political people
Yes, of course.
called my then news director
Sure.
and just tried to criticize me, and it was a very insulting email actually, and she shared it with me and I responded to him, and we have not spoken since,
That's sure.
saying that I basically was biased and I had I should not be writing any stories
sure,
about
sure, of course.
about Mayor Jones or Lyda Crewson or about the St. Louis American.
Sure.
How do you respond to the notion? First of all, I respond to my story and the notion that the paper backs Mayor Jones, doesn't criticize her, and should criticize her.
Well, let's give us a little bit of overview. I mean, the L.A. Times, Kansas City Star have done a mea culpa around their coverage of race, how they encourage certain kind of racial feelings. I think that the Post-Dispatch, in many cases, was unfair to Mayor Jones. I'm not arguing that people shouldn't ultimately make their own decision based on what they hear or see. And so that kind of one-sided journalism, in my view. I mean, we see ourselves overtly as something targeted to the African American community, and we see a lot of these issues through that lens. And I think that as long as it's fact-based, and I think that as a kind of a counter to some of the, I think, unfair coverage of at that time, candidate Jones, and the Lyda Crewson thing, quite frankly, I mean, she won that election over Tashara Jones in a multi-candidate race.
Right.
And there
And
were
can we
two,
just add the two?
There were two major black candidates
Yes.
in the race. And so when you get to politics at that level, when you start talking about principles and all that, I think that people step over the line often. The Post-Dispatch probably would argue that, they're balanced. Maybe Camel X as well, they're balanced. But most people bring some kind of bias into it. When we overtly say that, blacks have been underrepresented in political circles at the highest levels. And so we do feel a special obligation. But that doesn't mean that we should indulge in things that are not true. And I think the journalism requires us to be that. To say that we shouldn't have an advocacy position on our editorial pages or on with our columnists is just not, I don't accept that. I think that criticism is going to come, particularly if you're effective a little bit. But if you're going to get in the public space, the public conversation, that's a part of it. I mean, I don't know if you read the trolls in some of these papers. Anything that if she walked on water,
they would say what's wrong with her.
What's wrong with her? And I'm sure when I think she's wrong, we perhaps don't scream it from the rooftops, but we certainly don't. I don't support policies that she.
You don't support everything.
No, I don't support all her policies, and we might not be vigorous critics of her policies, but overall, I think that she deserves, some protection from some of what I think overzealous reporting that we saw in the Post-Dispatch.
I remember calling you during the time of the Ferguson protests.
Yes.
2024 will be 10
Yes.
years since Michael Brown was killed, and the Ferguson protests became an international story. And I wanted to interview you because to me, you are an elder in the tribe, and you are an elder statesman, and you've always been that to me, professionally and personally.
Thank you.
You never receive it, but I always say it, okay?
Thank you.
You said to me, do you remember what you said to me when I asked for an interview? I'll tell you what you said. You said, nobody wants to hear from an old man.
Sure.
And I said, they need to hear from you. you I don't believe you did the interview with me.
Right.
I don't think you did.
Yes.
But I do think, and even more so today, and maybe where you are today and how you feel about yourself, looking in the mirror and all that you've accomplished, you're more willing to speak as an elder in the tribe.
Well, I think that elders generally, I think there's value, but I do think we also have to be prepared to accept the new generation of leadership, and I think my role is more to be supportive. I also think as a person involved in journalism, even at the community journalism level, our job is not to direct attention to ourselves. This is not. It's.
You're not a celebrity.
I'm not a celebrity, and I'm not necessarily somebody that people should look to for insight or wisdom. It is my job to try to present, the kind of stories that we ought to have some interest. It's a little bit discouraging, quite frankly, to see what gets the hits on Instagram, for instance. It'll be something that'll be almost frivolous and something much more serious, much more thoughtful. I used to, occasionally people would ask me to come to speak, and they would say, well, why don't you take a more serious stance? Well, it's there. It's just you don't read it.
Right.
The headline may not be compelling, or maybe you don't like the lead or something. It is hard. Serious journalism, serious ideas, serious thought is sometimes, difficult. I mean, they're more interested in who got divorced or who...
Right. Who wore what?
Yeah, I don't want to sound be elitist and all that, but I like foolishness as well. But I mean, you ought to call it what it is.
Right.
I mean, I think that.
But I have to tell you too that at that time during the Ferguson protests, young people were saying Yana Van Sant came to Ferguson, and young people told her, y'all haven't talked to us.
That's right.
You left us behind. You didn't teach us. That's what this small group felt, but it's not an uncommon feeling among certain sectors of young people.
I think St. Louis is unique in a lot of ways, Carol. I think today I was at a meeting of so-called white corporate elite, and we were citing, some of the things that are going on in St. Louis in the last 50 years. So much of what determines what happens in our communities are beyond our control, the kind of macroeconomics. But some of us who have a little more familiarity with some of these issues need to have an understanding. One of the biggest problems with St. Louis, when I came to St. Louis, probably the city of St. Louis had 700,000 people. The level of leadership in the black community was a higher caliber than one sees today. So what happened to them, Donald? Well, I'll tell you what happened to them. They went to Houston. They went to Atlanta. They went to Dallas. They went to L.A. I have 3 children, and none of them elected to come back to St. Louis. Dawn came back for family reasons. But it's just not been a go-to place for some of our best and brightest folks, unfortunately. I live in St. Louis, and this is where I will live, because this is where I've spent my adult life and where I was embraced even when you took what are not necessarily popular stances. It's been so good to me, so welcoming for me. I will be forever grateful. And when I see people leave St. Louis and they say awful things, one of your colleagues left St. Louis and said terrible things about St. Louis, where she had been embraced. How dare me? How dare you turn your back on the people that supported you, have allowed you to be? None of these things would have been possible for me. I probably could have earned a good living elsewhere, but I could not have the fullness of the life I've had. But it's not me. It's not me. It's our community. This is to whom I am grateful.
Right.
I am grateful to my parents. I'm grateful to Elder Davis. I'm grateful to Elder Blakely. I'm grateful. I'm grateful. I'm grateful. And I've been to all those places. I'm fortunate, and if you want to call it fortunate, many times. And yet, for all that splendor, and I didn't say I didn't like it, I enjoy it, not first. I like it. I like good food, not first. Not first. My car, not first. These other things that I think, and if we as a people who still, I consider us to be in a lot of ways oppressed, if we don't recognize that there's a seriousness that we need to embrace, a seriousness. So why don't you watch that? I like that, but I don't let myself do that. It's like sweets. I will restrict myself to a certain amount of sweets because I know that it's not healthy.
Everything is good. That is good. It's not good for you.
Yeah, exactly.
You said that there are institutions that don't serve us.
Well,
there's some institutions that don't serve us.
Well, yes.
Which one or two or three do you
mean? I think some of our public servants, I don't think that they're well served in many instances where they don't have the kind of accountability to a community that they should have. Now, that's a very simplistic way to approach it. If you're outside it, it is a game. And it has a lot of nefarious practices and all that. But I think I don't want to be more specific than that. Okay. But I just know that I just think that and it's replicated in other communities as well. When you start to dilute your sense of self, and I think we're more than just black people, but that is a huge determinant of how we are dealt with in our society. If one looked at you, look at your physical appearance and all that, I can't predict. I look at the color of your eyes. We start looking at your genealogy. Politically, you're a black woman.
Right.
Tiger Woods can say whatever he wants about it. He's an Anglo, blah, blah, blah. People see him as a black person, and that's a political distinction. And if we don't recognize that, if we give up on that and don't teach our children that, to ignore that or to deny that, to not accept that as a part of your reality. And that means, as I say, I'm not anti, as you heard this expression of my best friends, people who've been more beneficial personally, to me personally, have not been black. So I'm not telling you that I don't like white people. I'm telling you I don't like certain institutions
that mistreat black people.
Mistreat black people.
Right.
And it's been it's been the name of my taste in art. So much of this is white, but I don't see them now. They use it to justify white supremacy. So what I say about that is a private thing, but don't say that it's not extraordinary, because it is. Now, it may not be valuable for us. They use it in ways that don't reflect very well on us because we haven't done it quite that way. That's not been our sensibility. But don't deny its validity. I mean, there's a lot of comfort. I mean, I know I live alone, so I know the music I listen to. Mm-hmm. I know what gives me, that has the kind of depth of the ability that evoke the kind of depth of feeling in you that when you go to church, you're dealing with that level of yourself. That for me is religiosity. That is, I don't care what your faith is or what your belief tradition is. That's indisputable in my view. Religiosity, the need for that to be nourished one's inner self,
right, and
moved. So I think then great art. I think great art. When you see the Pieta by Michael, I'm digressing a little bit here, and don't let me do that because we get over the.
Well,
art
let me
thing.
Stop you then, because your
please.
daughter, his daughter did. We talked a little bit before this.
He'll digress.
She told me make sure he does this, and this, and doesn't do this.
Don't let him talk about El Greco.
I did want to go back to two things, Ferguson and leadership.
Yes.
Regarding leadership, it seems to me, having covered news in this town, in this market for almost 30 years, that we focus on crime to the detriment of everything else. Crime is very real. People need to feel safe, for sure. But we have not spent enough time, as you mentioned, talking about the brain drain. I've told people, I have a son who lives here. He does not intend to stay here because he does not like St. Louis. My other son is in Chicago. Dreamed of living in a handful of cities. Chicago was at the top five for him.
Yes.
And he is loving Chicago.
Chicago, sure.
But he grew up here, does not want to live here.
Live in St. Louis, yes.
So the brain drain is real. He's a software developer. The brain drain is real. And one of my nieces said to me, St. Louis is missing a vibe. Now, this was 15 years ago.
Of course.
Now, there is a growing, I say that word, vibe, like I'm 25 years old. But do you think that we as leaders are missing the mark in what it will take to create young leaders and get our young people to stay and cultivate this region?
I think
Black leaders, especially.
Particularly young people when they make that decision. I think that these are macroeconomics that's something out of our control, quite frankly.
For sure.
Out of our control. And I think that St. Louis hasn't been a go-to city for a very long time. I came here, you came here probably circumstantial. I came here
for the
circumstantial.
job.
Yeah, so did I. I came here because I wanted to go to a black hospital. Because I didn't know what St. Louis was. And St. Louis at that time was a lot more, in quotes, attractive than it is today. So, this is not unique to black people. The white community has had the same problem. And perhaps it's more heightened among black folks. I don't know. As I say, I had 3 children. None of them elected to stay in St. Louis. And in your case, you're very well established, well known, and I would assume your children grew up in a privileged situation. It's so complicated because that's out of our control. I think what St. Louis has to be able to do, and I think its best chances for that, it has to do with technology. If we can see some kind of technology advance, if in geospatial or biomed or something, once you see opportunity, and people tend to gather around like-minded people, and I know this to be a fact. I mean, I go to New York a lot. We used to have an apartment in New York, actually, and they got places that got dumpsters outside, and it's a 5-star restaurant. But if you can find something that's compelling for people, so Atlanta 50 years ago wasn't that compelling. Now it is.
Nashville was nothing.
It was nothing. Indianapolis, they've done more with less. I don't think St. Louis is going to be able to compete with somebody who wants to live near an ocean or in California or whatever. But my notion about that is you don't need them all. You just need some. And there are some people, and I'll use this, I digress very quickly. One of my daughters went to graduate school in Philadelphia. So when I was in town, they'd go to a little nicer restaurant. And she had 2 very distinct different groups of friends. One group said, I want to go where there is lifestyle. I want to go to whether
like Miami.
yeah,
or,
Miami, or I want to go where it's happening. And the other group says, I want to go where there's opportunity. And I cite for them when George H.W. Bush left Connecticut, where he was an aristocrat, and he went to Texas. He didn't go to Houston. He didn't go to Austin. He didn't go to Dallas. He went to West Texas. You ever been to West Texas?
No.
Let me tell you about West Texas. You don't want to go. You know why you haven't been? There's no reason to go. But you know why he went? He went for opportunity. If St. Louis, and this is what I say to the corporate folks that ask me, until you make this a place where there's opportunity, why do I like St. Louis? I've had the opportunity to, as a person, I go to L.A. and watch rich people having fun. I mean, I'm supposed to say, this house costs $25 billion. That's not my personality. I want to go, where's mine? What am I going to do? I mean, is there work for me to do? If I can run a St. Louis American in St. Louis, and there's no way I can run a newspaper in L.A., then I'm not taking L.A.
Right.
I like L.A., and I'm not saying anything wrong with it. And some folks are always going to be persuaded by that. Others are more serious-minded, and they want something that is, as an elder, what's important for me is to know that I try to do some work that my parents would value. That's the measure for me, not how many times have I told you I had an apartment in New York for 15 years. I mean, I was, as a poor boy, you mix with some folks at D.C., I've been to the White House a number of times. None of that's not me. Here, you get to do some work. I learned this from my artist friends. I said, man, you sitting here making this chip. He said, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
And we're going to leave on, I am going to ask you about your art. If you ever get a chance to go to the St. Louis American offices, you will see some of the art you have been collecting. For how many years have you been collecting?
I've been collecting.
Art?
But the thing about art is it depends on what level you are interested in it. I mean, it's like saying all classical music sounds the same. That's because you don't hear the differences. They're profound. But if you're not a listener, if you don't understand music, then you don't know, why are you getting so excited about this? So the same thing goes for art. People come and say, I want to collect art. Well, I mean, and there's no reason why you have to be interested at a certain level. But if you're interested in a more deep level, then you're going to have to be prepared to take a little time. It's like you as a journalist. You do your column, you can just write something off the top of your head, or you can also, I'm going to compose.
He's so excited he's banging on the mic.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I think that my interest in art is just, for me, it's been so enlightening. And so my friends and this is something that maybe I shouldn't say publicly, but
you say it.
Well, they've done well. They live in L.A. and they have an art collection, and it's very ordinary. It doesn't reflect any kind of refined taste. It's not a question of whether one likes or doesn't like. There's nothing happening here artistically, because if you saw what art can do and be, this doesn't do any of that.
Was it from your exposure when you would go see your grandmother?
Yeah,
I went to the museum. Did it start with music in the museums?
Oh,
yeah,
I saw El Greco, and I saw Van Gogh, and it was just those images stayed with me. I tried to draw a little bit myself, and I wasn't very talented, but it's always, for me, had a certain appeal. I just always wanted to be in an environment where this was available to me, and so the more I've learned, the more it's very rich. And as I've gotten older, where I'm less interested in traveling to Paris or whatever, is that, so when I go to New York, I'm going to see the Manet Degas show, because I know that work. Because I've spent years and years and years. It's just like you as a journalist, when you know somebody good at your craft.
I want to hear them. I want to read them.
Precisely. That's what I'm saying about art. I mean, it's a question of how deep. There's no requirement. That just happens to be my thing, whether it's golf or whatever happens to be your thing. And for me, it's just been so rewarding. In cities like St. Louis, I don't care about the nightlife. I don't care about seeing Beyonce. I mean, I wouldn't, but I'm an
He
old
said
man.
that out loud. That's what he said out
Yeah,
loud.
yeah, but I think she's a good entertainer and
But
all
you,
that.
the art
I've
scene
seen her a
in
couple
St.
times.
Louis is
Well, I'm much more vibrant. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a very. I mean, you've got some extraordinary collections. The collection that's at the art museum and at the Kemper and at Contemporary Art Museum, and there's a superb, wonderful, extraordinary building. It's known by a Japanese architect called Tadao. You'll drive right past it, you don't even see it. But if you know what you're looking at, oh my goodness! Every time you walk in that space. Same thing happens. You go to those cathedrals in Europe, you
Right.
see the spirit. You know, these men were inspired. They didn't just
Right.
come, they weren't just talented. You see the Pietà, it make you want to cry. Michelangelo, he got the picture, Christ, Mother, holding, oh my goodness. But it requires some learning, some looking more carefully. Not for everybody, you know.
I feel like what you just said, it's a beautiful way to wrap it up, but what you just said, it requires some learning and some looking, is the message for Black leadership and for Black people, that in order to grow, to be safer, to be successful, to find and create opportunity, it requires some learning and some looking.
And to realize something higher
Bigger,
than
higher.
ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Suggs.
So, well, this has been my pleasure. I wish we had more time because
We can keep talking.
Just warming up. Just warming up. Oh, I love it. I love it. I think it's terribly interesting for other people, but no, I've lived here a long time and I've seen a lot of different aspects of life here.
Are you hopeful? Or are you
Well, I
worried?
think, yeah,
Or are you worried?
Yeah, well, I'm concerned about what happens overall because, after all, we're 12% of the population. We won't drive the change. We'll have to be a part of a coalition of like-minded people. You always have hope, and you also can't get seduced into the notion that it has to happen in this moment or in your. You have to believe so strongly that if not me, what about my children? Like my parents did.
Yes.
It won't happen in my lifetime. My parents, I told my sister, anything my mother wants on the material side. But my mother died content because she had been a good mother. She'd been a good steward in her church. So everything wasn't going well, but she left in her children the values. She left in my sister, and less so in me, but to some extent me as well.
And now
she
in her
said,
great-granddaughter.
Yeah, she said, Donald, she put her hands on me. Son, my mother, this is off.
No, it is not. We're still
But
rolling.
I'm going to just tell you, I used to belong to a group, about suffering. They talk about suffering, about his mother and her experiences in Europe and all that. I said, listen, I empathize with you and that suffering. That's horrific. But my mother suffered, but that's different. I said, what's different? I mean, you're telling me that you love your mother more deeply than I love my mother because my mother's poor and black. The meeting's over. I'm out of here. My mama, my mother.
And she put her hand on your shoulder.
On my shoulders and said, Donald, my mother. I'd be like, I don't cry. My father passed away. I'm sitting like this because we were on good terms. He left, hold my father's hand.
Come close to the mic. I want to hear all of this.
My sister started talking about her grandfather. Just tears come down your eyes. You don't know how deeply you feel about this. So that's, for me, as long as you have that, and I see that in my granddaughter, I know look, life's
You
a
have
cycle.
hope.
We're gonna be gone. Something's gonna be
For
gone.
sure.
But my mother lives on. My father lives on.
And your mother was 100 and
6
when she passed.
when she passed away.
106.
But such a special spirit.
And so the question of whether you have hope or you're worried because of your mother's influence that you can now see in your granddaughter, you have
yes,
hope.
in my personal family, but I think the world, I don't think, as we talk in political terms, empires come and go. This one may not be long-lived. I just see the seeds of its destruction. You see what's going on now. You have a man like who's former president in a country that gets that base, that's off the, just so, that's disturbing. So I don't know that this empire, and we are in it, in the middle of it, is going to last. We just have to take care of what we can take care of.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Take care of what you can take care of. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great conversation.
Why I wouldn't have me, but thank you very much. In any case, right?
That is
in any case, I'm
Dr.
so pleased.
Donald M.
I'm
Suggs,
so pleased. I'm so pleased.
the
It's been my
publisher of the
pleasure.
St.
My
Louis
pleasure.
American.
My pleasure.
Thank
My
you, thank
pleasure.
you, thank
It's
you.
Always.
He does not do many interviews, but he did this one on Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Listen, St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center and the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation.